Welcome back after the break. And we discussed dispersed rural settlements and nucleated rural settlements. Now the first one we just discussed just before the break is nucleated settlements. Now there's a couple of reasons why these farmers decide to live close together. It can be because of safety. It's much safer to live as a community together. It can be because of the two types of settlements that might be influencing them. And we talk about dry point settlements and wet point settlements. Now, a dry point settlement is usually when the farmers will be nucleated because there's not an abundance of water. So it's usually where water is situated on a rural area. So what will happen? The farmers will be nucleated close to the water resource because they might need it for irrigation. Now, with a wet point settlement, this is quite important as well. A wet point settlement is just the difference between, it's just exactly the opposite of a dry point settlement. It's usually the farmers will live at the higher ground because they might be affected by the floodplain. So basically, they try to move away from areas that's affected by water. Now, dispersed settlements, the farmers may choose to live very far from one another. It's because there's abundance of water and they rather use the land for crop farming, and because there's abundance of water, irrigation won't be a problem. So they choose to live further away from one another so they can use more of the land. Now, like we discussed before, we looked at it, the nucleated pattern, the farmsteads are very close to one another, nucleated, and if you look at dispersed, on the next page, they are quite isolated. They are quite far from one another. You won't find the farmsteads close to one another, and in between them is the yields and the land full of crops. Now, the simple reason why people choose the location of rural settlement, because people don't just rock up at the place and arrive at the place and say, we're going to start farming. They need to look at certain aspects to make sure that this will be a very good location to settle. Now, and that's two terms that we need to concentrate on. We need to go and look at the site of a settlement, and we need to look at the situation of a settlement. Now, the site of a rural settlement refers to the exact piece of ground the settlement's found. Now, when they chose Johannesburg back in the day to settle because gold is found, they need to look at the land, at the topography. And when we look at the settlement, we need to look at the surrounding environment. Now, when we look at this is a diagram showing the site and the situation surrounds it. And we're going to fill in these factors now. If you look at the site of the rural settlement, people need to make sure there's availability of water, because it's impossible to farm if there's not going to be enough water for their crops. And then they need to look at the soil. Is it fertile? Will we be able to plant the crops? Or is it instead going to be better to do cattle farming for grazing? So that's the factors that they need to keep in mind. And then obviously once they move there, is there going to be building materials to build their villages and their homesteads? And is it worth it? Because there's no point if you find a place with enough water and enough grazing land and fertile soil, but unfortunately there's nothing to use for building material, and such as fuel for wood. If you look at the situation of settlement, very important over here, it needs to be above the flood line of the river. Now, they've chosen the site. If we go back to this diagram over here, Now they've chosen the site. There's water, there's fertile soil, and there's grazing land. Now that's the site of the settlement. Now the situation is, once they decided to move over there, and let's say this water that's been represented over there is a river, they can't go and build their houses in the floodplain. What will happen during rainy season? What's happening with the water level? It rises. So they need to build their houses quite far from the floodplain to make sure they don't put their own lives into danger. And then what we've learned in the climate section, let's say for instance the settlement is situated in a valley. Now once again, what did we say? The site, the availability of water, fertile soil, and grazing land, and availability of building material. Now let's say for instance the site they've chosen is inside the valley. Now what have we learned? Where should they go and build their houses? On the north-facing slopes, because it receives more insulation. The south-facing slopes, oblique insulation. So the warm-facing slopes will be warmer, probably better for crop farming. And build their settlements in the thermal belt because it will be much warmer. We won't build our houses down in the bottom of the valley. Why not? Because we might experience very cold conditions, and obviously we experience the frost pocket down there. And if we do settle down there, just rather farm down there, and keep in mind, remember to farm frost-resistant crops. Now, as you can see, in the thermal belt, it's much warmer, the north-facing slopes like we discussed, and very importantly, if we go back to this diagram over here, the situation, it might need to be close access to a road. Now keep in mind, many farmers farm with perishable goods. For instance, like milk and tomatoes. It's no point if you're a farmer in the Northern Cape province, you've got enough water, you've got enough fertile land, but the closest town where you need to sell your product is 8-9 hours away. Now what happens with perishable goods? It can go off. So access to transport routes are very important. Now, unfortunately, over the years, we experience the movement of people away from rural areas. So it means people move away from these farming communities and rather go and move to urban areas such as Johannesburg, Bloemfontein, Cape Town, and Durban. Now, if you look at the definition of rural-urban migration, is the movement of people from rural areas to urban areas. Now, over the years, they reckon in 15 years' time that most of the population in South Africa will be urbanized. Now, the reason why this migration is taking place is because of the pull and push factors. If you look at the next slide, and it's of great concern why people are leaving the rural areas. Now, first of all, let's look at the push factors. But please, Great Charles, don't get confused between the two. Now, keep this in mind. What pushes you away from the rural areas? And what pulls you towards the urban areas? And let's quickly have a look at these factors. Now, if we look at the push factors, now I'm not only talking about the communities, but I'm talking about the farmers themselves. The first one is natural disasters. Now, a couple of years ago, South Africa experienced El Nino. You've learned about it in grade 11. Now, it's a natural occurrence that happens every other year, and El Nino is a drought that we experienced in Southern Africa. Now, you need to remember, a farmer only receives one paycheck per year. Now let's say, for instance, if you look at in South Africa, what does a farmer do? Now, usually harvest end of autumn, early autumn, April, March. Then it's winter, we don't receive much rainfall. And just before September, what does the farmer do? He starts planting. Now, he relies on rainfall for the crop to grow. Now, South Africa, most of South Africa, during the summer, we experience summer rainfall. It rains, the crop grows, and end of February, harvest season basically starts to harvest. Now, imagine if this farmer planted his crops, but there was no rain. That means if there's no rain, his crops is not going to grow. That means he's not going to harvest, he's not going to sell any of his products, and it means he's not going to make any money. And eventually what happens, many farmers just decided, done with it, rather going to sell the farm, and then move to urban areas. In many cases, unfortunately, in South Africa, we don't experience floods extensively, but in other countries, floods can also cause that farmers decided to move away from rural areas. Now keep in mind, this has a massive impact on South Africa. If that farmer moves away, what happens to employment? The people that he employ, they tend to pack up and leave as well. Now, a great concern is lack of facilities. Now keep this in mind, there's not many services that's been provided in urban areas and rural areas. For example, let's say for instance there's schools. There might just be a primary school. But then as soon as you want to go to high school, what do you need to do? You need to move away from those rural areas and you need to go and stay in a hostel. Another reason why, especially the rural-urban migration, is tertiary education. People tend to, if you look at where do you find your major colleges and universities, is usually in urban areas. So that's definitely a push factor. There's not enough facilities that the people can enjoy in rural areas. The same with hospitals and clinics. Unfortunately, if you move to these small rural towns, there might be a doctor, but there's no one specialized to treat certain disease or circumstances. Now, the biggest problem that we face in South Africa is lack of services. Unfortunately, many rural areas do not have the basic needs and services, and we're talking clean drinking water and electricity. Believe it or not, there's still places in South Africa that struggles, rural settlements that do not have access to clean drinking water and electricity. And unfortunately, there's a lack of jobs. Now, if you think of rural settlements, it's mostly primary activities. So we looked at it, intensive farming, extensive farming. So if you do want to find a job in rural settlements, it's got to do with primary activities. It's either going to be mining, forestry, farming, or fishing. So unfortunately, there's limited jobs, and there's a little variety of jobs that we find in rural settlements. And that's a push factor because people want to start earning a living. Now, another problem in rural areas is lack of housing, and we're coming back to the Southern situation. Simple reason for it is because there's not enough building material. And unfortunately, these days, we need building material. You need money to buy building material. And in this case, lack of housing leads to the rural-urban migration. And people rather going to stay in urban areas, but in informal settlements because they can't afford proper housing. Another great concern in rural areas is poverty. Unfortunately, the standard of living is not very high over there because there's not enough services and they lack basic needs and services. So that's another reason why. Now, if you look at, for instance, if you look at salaries between urban areas and rural areas, salaries are much lower in rural areas than in urban areas. Now, if you look at the pull factors, what makes urban areas for the people so much better than the rural areas? Why would the people want to move away from these rural areas to the urban areas. Now keep in mind, what was the push factors? It pushes you away from the rural areas. Unemployment, you can't find a job. There's not proper schooling. There's not proper medical services. So it pushes you away. You need to go there because you might find better services. We looked at it, there's a lack of housing. Once again, and it lacks the basic needs of services. Or it might have been you worked on this farm and there was a drought that was being experienced. So that pushes you away from these rural areas. After the break, we're quickly going to have a look at the pull factors. What pulls the people towards the urban areas?